Sometimes the past has a way of finding you when you least expect it, especially when you're trying to be the father you never had. Sheriff Jake Morrison thought he'd buried his old life 20 years ago, but that changed the morning his 9-year-old daughter Emma spotted a German shepherd tied near the telegraph office. "Can we take that dog, Papa?" she asked softly. When Jake looked at the animal, he froze. The dog was identical to Buck, his partner who died saving his life in another town, another time. Same brown eyes, same white patch on the chest, same way of looking right through a man's soul. Buck was supposed to be dead and buried beneath an oak tree, where Jake left his badge and his guilt. Now this dog sits in Dry Willow, staring at him like it knows all his secrets. Jake spent 2 decades building a quiet life for his daughter, but some ghosts refused to stay buried. The truth about what really happened that day could destroy everything he's worked for. How do you explain the impossible when your child is watching and waiting for an answer? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and dust through the streets of Dry Willow, a town that time seemed to have forgotten somewhere between the railroad boom and the modern world. Sheriff Jake Morrison had grown to love that scent over the past 20 years. It meant safety, predictability, and distance from the life he'd left behind. At 48, Jake had the weathered hands of a man who'd seen too, much but the gentle eyes of someone determined to do better. The morning sun painted the adobe buildings in shades of gold and amber as Jake made his usual rounds, checking in with Mrs. Chen at the general store and nodding to Doc Martinez as the old physician unlocked his clinic. These were good people, salt-of-the-earth folk who asked few questions and offered steady friendship. They knew Jake as a fair sheriff, a devoted father, and a man who kept his own counsel. What they didn't know was that Sheriff Jake Morrison had once been Detective Jake Morrison of the Silver Creek Police Department, and that the man they trusted with their safety had spent 2 decades running from his own past. Emma Morrison bounced on her toes beside her father as they walked down Main Street, her strawberry blonde pigtails catching the morning light. At 9 years old, she possessed an intelligence that often startled adults, and a curiosity that kept Jake on his toes. She'd inherited her mother's keen eyes and quick mind, along with a stubborn streak that Jake recognized as purely his own. "Papa, why don't we ever talk about Mama?" Emma asked as they passed the old telegraph office, her small hand finding his larger one. It was a question she'd been asking more frequently lately, and each time it felt like a knife turning in Jake's chest. "We do talk about her, sweetheart," Jake replied, squeezing her hand gently. "Remember how I told you she had the prettiest voice in all of Silver Creek? And how she could make anybody laugh, even on their worst day? But you never tell me how she died," Emma pressed, her voice taking on that determined tone he knew all too well. "Other kids at school know how their mamas and papas died. Sally's mama died of cancer, and Tommy's daddy died in a car crash. But you just say Mama went to heaven." Jake felt his chest tighten. How could he explain to a 9-year-old that her mother had been murdered because of his work? That Sarah Morrison had died in a car bomb meant for him, and that he'd been too consumed with his case to see the danger until it was too late. Some truths were too heavy for small shoulders to carry. Some stories are harder to tell than others, Emma. Your mama was taken from us too soon, and sometimes grown-ups need time to find the right words. He stopped walking and knelt down to her level, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "But I can tell you this, she loved you more than anything in this world, even though she only got to hold you for a few hours." Emma studied his face with those perceptive eyes, and Jake could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was too smart for her own good, just like her mother had been. "Okay, Papa," she said finally, though he could tell she wasn't entirely satisfied with his answer. "But someday you'll tell me the whole story, right?" "Someday," Jake promised, though he prayed that day would never come. They continued their walk through town, Jake's trained eyes automatically scanning for anything out of place. 20 years of small-town sheriffing hadn't dulled his instincts. If anything, the quiet had sharpened them. He noticed things, the way strangers carried themselves, the unusual cars that passed through town, the subtle changes in people's routines that might signal trouble. Deputy Sarah Chen waved from the sheriff's office as they passed, already at her desk despite the early hour. Sarah was 35, efficient, and one of the few people in Dry Willow who sometimes looked at Jake like she suspected there was more to his story. She'd moved to town 5 years ago from Phoenix, citing a desire for small-town life, but Jake recognized something in her eyes that spoke of its own secrets. "Morning, Sheriff." "Morning, Emma," Sarah called out. "Don't forget you have that meeting with the county supervisor at 10. "Thanks, Sarah. We'll be right in." Jake turned to Emma, who was already eyeing the dog tied up near the telegraph office. The German shepherd sat quietly in the shade, panting slightly in the morning heat. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who ran the telegraph office, kept the dog tied there most mornings while she worked. "That dog's been there every day this week," Emma observed, her voice thoughtful. "Mrs. Patterson says his name is Rusty, but he doesn't look like a Rusty to me." Jake glanced at the animal and felt something cold settle in his stomach. The dog was watching them, not the casual observation of a bored animal, but the focused attention of a trained working dog. When their eyes met, Jake felt a jolt of recognition so strong it nearly knocked him off balance. Brown eyes with flecks of gold, a white patch shaped like a star on the chest. Ears that stood at attention when focused, but relaxed into a gentle expression when at ease. The way the dog held its head, tilted slightly to the right when listening. "Papa, are you okay?" Emma's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Jake blinked, realizing he'd been staring at the dog for several long moments. The animal continued to watch him with those familiar eyes, and Jake could have sworn he saw recognition there too. "I'm fine, sweetheart." Just thinking, he forced himself to look away from the dog and focus on his daughter. "Come on, let's get to the office. I've got paperwork to catch up on." But as they walked away, Jake could feel the dog's gaze following them, and memories he'd spent 20 years burying began to claw their way to the surface. Buck had been the best partner Jake had ever worked with, human or otherwise. The German shepherd had been trained for narcotics detection, but his intelligence went far beyond his official duties. Buck could read people, situations, and danger in ways that had saved Jake's life more than once. When they'd worked the corruption case that ultimately destroyed Jake's life, Buck had been right there beside him, loyal and fearless until the very end. The night Buck died still haunted Jake's dreams. The warehouse, the smell of river water and rust, the sound of footsteps on metal stairs. Jake had gone in first, Buck at his side, following a lead that had promised to break their case wide open. Instead, they'd walked into an ambush. Jake remembered the flash of gunfire, Buck's sharp bark of warning, then pain and darkness. When he'd awakened in the hospital 3 days later, they'd told him Buck was dead, shot while trying to protect Jake from the men who'd left them both for dead. Jake had buried Buck beneath an old oak tree on the outskirts of Silver Creek, along with his badge, his career, and his belief that justice always prevailed. 2 weeks later, he'd taken his newborn daughter and disappeared into the desert, eventually settling in Dry Willow, where no one asked questions about a single father looking for a fresh start. Back in the sheriff's office, Jake tried to focus on the stack of reports on his desk, but his mind kept drifting to the dog outside the telegraph office. It was impossible, of course. Buck had been dead for 20 years. Dogs didn't live that long, and even if they did, what were the odds that an identical animal would end up in the same small town where Jake had chosen to hide? "Papa, can I go visit the dog?" Emma asked from her chair in the corner where she was working on her homework. She often spent time at the office after school, and Jake had set up a small area with a desk and books to keep her occupied. "I don't think that's a good idea, sweetheart. We don't know that dog, and Mrs. Patterson might not appreciate visitors. But Mrs. Patterson likes me," Emma protested. "She always gives me candy when we go to mail. Letters to Grandma Rose, and the dog looks lonely." Jake looked up from his paperwork to find Emma watching. him with that determined expression he'd learned to recognize as trouble. She'd inherited her mother's stubborn streak, along with her intelligence. And when Emma Morrison set her mind on something, she usually found a way to make it happen. Maybe later, he said, hoping to distract her with delay. Right now you need to focus on your mathematics. Emma nodded, but Jake could see she wasn't giving up. She returned to her homework with unusual concentration, and Jake felt a familiar mixture of pride and worry. Emma was growing up, asking harder questions and pushing against the boundaries he'd carefully constructed around their life. Soon, his non-answers about her mother and their past wouldn't be enough. She deserved better than the half-truths and careful omissions that had defined her childhood. Hidden in the bottom drawer of his desk, wrapped in an old chamois cloth, Jake kept the only reminders of his former life: Buck's collar and his own detective's badge from Silver Creek. He told himself he kept them as reminders of why he'd left that life behind. But sometimes late at night, he'd take them out and remember what it felt like to believe in something bigger than survival. Buck's collar was worn leather with a brass nameplate that simply read Buck SCPD. The badge was tarnished now, its silver surface dull with age and neglect. Together, they represented everything Jake had lost and everything he was trying to protect Emma from. As the day wore on, Jake found himself glancing out the window toward the telegraph office more often than he cared to admit. The dog remained in its spot, alert and watchful. Several times, Jake could have sworn the animal was looking directly at the sheriff's office. And as if it knew exactly where Jake was sitting, by late afternoon, Emma had finished her homework and was growing restless. Jake watched her fidget with her pencils and rearrange her books. Clear signs that she was working up to asking about the dog again. "Papa," she began, using the sweet voice that usually preceded a request. "Mrs. Patterson is closing up the telegraph office. Maybe now would be a good time to say hello to the dog?" Jake looked out the window and saw the elderly woman locking up her building. The dog sat patiently beside her, waiting for whatever came next in its daily routine. "Emma, please, Papa. Just for a minute? I promise I won't get too close if you don't think it's safe." Jake found himself studying his daughter's face. Seeing so much of Sarah there, it made his heart ache. Emma had never known her mother, but she'd inherited Sarah's compassion and her unwillingness to ignore someone in need, even if that someone happened to be a dog that might or might not be a ghost from Jake's past. "All right," he said finally. "But we stay together, and if I say we leave, we leave. No arguments." Emma's face lit up with the kind of joy that reminded Jake why he'd do anything to protect her smile. "Thank you, Papa. I promise I'll be good." They walked across the dusty street to where Mrs. Patterson was preparing to load the dog into the back of her ancient pickup truck. The elderly woman looked up as they approached, her weathered face creasing into a smile. "Sheriff Morrison, Emma. How nice to see you both. Out for an evening walk?" "Something like that," Jake replied, his eyes fixed on the dog. Up close, the resemblance to Buck was even more unsettling. Every marking, every detail seemed identical to his memories. "That's a fine-looking animal you have there." "Oh, Rusty isn't mine," Mrs. Patterson said, patting the dog's head affectionately. "I'm just watching him for a few days while his owner is out of town, though I have to say he's the best-behaved dog I've ever met. Almost like he was professionally trained." Jake's blood turned to ice in his veins. "Professionally trained?" "Oh yes, he knows all sorts of commands. Sit, stay, heel, but also some unusual ones. Yesterday I accidentally dropped my keys and said search, just talking to myself, you know. This fellow found them under my desk in less than 10 seconds. Strangest thing." Emma had moved closer to the dog, her hand extended for him to sniff. The animal remained perfectly still, alert but non-threatening, as he examined her scent. Then slowly his tail began to wag. "Can we take that dog, Papa?" Emma asked softly, her voice filled with the kind of longing that broke Jake's heart. "He likes me, see? And Mrs. Patterson says his owner might not come back." Jake looked at the dog, really looked at him, and felt 20 years of careful control begin to crumble. The dog was looking back at him now with those familiar brown eyes, and Jake could have sworn he saw recognition there. Not the casual acknowledgement of a stranger, but the focused attention of a partner who'd been waiting patiently for his handler to find him. It was impossible. It was crazy. Dogs didn't live 20 years, and they certainly didn't track down their former partners across hundreds of miles and 2 decades of time. But as Jake stared into those familiar eyes, he began to wonder if impossible and crazy might not be the same thing as untrue. "We'll see, sweetheart," he managed to say, though his voice sounded strange in his own ears. "We'll see." That night, Jake lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his small bedroom, listening to the desert wind whistle through the eaves of their modest house. Emma had gone to bed hours ago, but not before asking 3 more times about the dog and whether they could visit him again tomorrow. Each question had been like a chisel working at the walls Jake had built around his past, and he could feel them beginning to crack. At 2 in the morning, he gave up on sleep and padded quietly to his desk, pulling out the bottom drawer where Buck's collar and his old badge lay wrapped in their cloth. The leather was still supple after all these years, and the brass nameplate caught the moonlight streaming through his window. Jake ran his fingers over the familiar surface, remembering the weight of it around Buck's neck and the comfort of knowing his partner was beside him. A soft, scratching sound at the front door made him freeze. Jake held his breath, listening. There it was again. Not the random scratching of a raccoon or coyote, but a deliberate rhythmic pattern. 3 scratches, pause, 2 scratches, pause. It was a signal Buck used to give when he wanted Jake's attention during surveillance operations. Jake's hands trembled as he set down the collar. He was losing his mind. 20 years of guilt and loneliness had finally caught up with him, and now he was hearing ghosts in the desert wind. But the scratching came again, more insistent this time, and Jake found himself walking toward the front door, despite every rational thought screaming at him to stay in bed. He peered through the peephole and saw nothing but shadows and starlight. The scratching stopped. Jake waited, his heart hammering against his ribs, then slowly opened the door. The German shepherd sat on his porch, patient and alert, as if he'd been waiting there for hours. In the moonlight, his coat looked silver, and his eyes reflected the stars. He wasn't panting or showing any signs of distress. He simply sat and watched Jake with that familiar, intelligent gaze. "This isn't possible," Jake whispered. But even as he said it, he was kneeling down to the dog's level. The animal remained perfectly still as Jake extended his hand, allowing him to catch his scent. Then slowly, the dog moved forward and pressed his head against Jake's palm. The touch was electric. Jake felt 20 years of grief and guilt crash over him like a wave, followed by something he'd thought was lost forever: hope. This dog knew him. Somehow, impossibly, this was Buck. "How?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible. "How are you here?" The dog, Buck, tilted his head in that familiar way, then turned toward the street as if listening to something Jake couldn't hear. His ears were pricked forward, his body tense with alertness. After a moment, he looked back at Jake and whined softly, a sound that meant danger in their old partnership. Jake's training kicked in, overriding his emotional turmoil. He scanned the street, looking for whatever had caught Buck's attention. At first he saw nothing, then noticed a dark sedan parked at the far end of the block. It hadn't been there when he'd locked up the office, and in a town the size of Dry Willow, Jake knew every vehicle that belonged. Buck whined again, more urgently this time, then trotted toward the side of the house. Jake followed, his bare feet silent on the dusty ground. The dog led him to the bedroom window where Emma slept, then sat down and looked up at Jake meaningfully. "She's safe," Jake murmured, but even as he said it, he was thinking about the sedan and wondering who might have followed them here after all these years. Buck's presence couldn't be a coincidence, not after 20 years of silence. Jake made a decision that went against every instinct he'd developed since moving to Dry Willow. Instead of sending Buck away and pretending this encounter never happened, he opened the front door wider. "Come on then," he said quietly. "But you'll have to be quiet." Emma's sleeping. Buck padded into the house with the confidence of an animal who knew he belonged there. He made a quick circuit of the main rooms, checking corners and shadows with professional thoroughness. then returned to Jake and sat at attention. "I need to know how you're here," Jake said, settling onto the couch. Buck immediately moved to sit beside him, not quite touching, but close enough that Jake could feel his warmth. "I buried you, partner. I buried you and said goodbye and tried to forget." Buck's response was to rest his head on Jake's knee, a gesture so familiar it brought tears to Jake's eyes. They sat together in the darkness, man and dog, while Jake tried to process the impossible. The next morning, Emma's delighted squeal woke Jake from the first peaceful sleep he'd had in years. He dozed off on the couch with Buck beside him, and now his daughter was kneeling in front of them both, her eyes wide with wonder. "Papa!" "The dog came to visit us." "How did he know where we live?" Jake rubbed his eyes, momentarily disoriented. In the morning light, Buck looked older than Jake remembered, with silver threading through his coat and a few new scars visible on his muzzle. But there was no doubt in Jake's mind now. This was his partner, somehow alive after 20 years. "I think he followed our scent," Jake said, which was true enough. "Emma, we need to talk about this dog. Can we keep him?" "Please, Papa. He likes me, and he obviously likes you too. And Mrs. Patterson said his owner might not come back." "Slow down, sweetheart." Jake stood up, his joints protesting the night spent on the couch. Buck rose as well, stretching in a way that revealed the careful movements of an aging animal. "First, we need to make sure he doesn't belong to someone. And we need to find out how he ended up in Dry Willow." Emma was already filling a bowl with water for Buck, who accepted it gratefully but kept one eye on Jake at all times. The dog's behavior was triggering memories Jake had tried to bury, the way Buck always positioned himself to watch both Jake and their surroundings, the subtle signs that indicated his level of alertness, the protective instincts that had made him the best partner Jake had ever worked with. "Papa, look at this," Emma said, pointing to Buck's neck. "He's got a collar, but it looks old." Jake knelt beside them and examined the worn leather collar around Buck's neck. It was different from the one he remembered, newer but still well worn. Attached to it was a small metal tag with a phone number, but no name. "We should call that number," Emma suggested. "Maybe someone's looking for him." Jake's stomach clenched at the thought, but he nodded. If Buck was really alive, if he'd somehow survived the shooting 20 years ago, then someone had been caring for him all this time. Jake owed it to that person, and to Buck, to find out the truth. He dialed the number from his cell phone, while Emma gave Buck a thorough petting. The phone rang several times before an elderly man's voice answered. "Doc Henley's clinic. Dr. Henley. This is Sheriff Morrison from Dry Willow. I'm calling about a German shepherd that has your number on his tag." There was a long pause before the veterinarian responded. "Sheriff Morrison? Well, I'll be damned. I've been waiting 20 years for this phone call." Jake's blood ran cold. "Excuse me? That dog you've got there, his name's Buck, isn't it? German shepherd, about 20 years old, white star on his chest, trained for police work?" Jake sank into a chair, his legs suddenly weak. "How do you know that?" "Because I'm the one who saved his life 20 years ago when someone brought him to my clinic with 3 bullet wounds and a collapsed lung. Took me 6 months to get him back on his feet, and even then I wasn't sure he'd ever be the same. But he was a fighter, that one. Wouldn't give up. Who brought him to you?" Jake managed to ask. "Can't say I recall the name, but he was a police detective from Silver Creek. Said the dog belonged to his partner, who'd been killed in the line of duty. Asked me to do whatever I could to save him, then disappeared one day and never came back. Left detailed instructions about the dog's care and enough money to cover his expenses for years." Jake closed his eyes, remembering Captain Frank Rawlings, his supervisor on the corruption case. Frank had been the one to tell him Buck was dead, the one who'd urged Jake to leave Silver Creek and start over somewhere safe. "Sheriff Morrison, you still there?" "I'm here," Jake said. "Where has Buck been all these years?" "Living on a ranch about 200 miles from here. The owner was a retired canine trainer who specialized in caring for old police dogs. Buck's been there for most of the past 20 years, but the owner passed away last month. Before he died, he made arrangements for Buck to be brought here to Dry Willow. Said there was someone here who needed to find him." Jake stared at Buck, who was now lying at Emma's feet with his head on her lap. The dog was watching Jake with those familiar brown eyes, and for the first time in 20 years, Jake felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Dr. Henley," Jake said slowly, "I need to know everything about who brought Buck to you and who's been caring for him. And I need to know if anyone else has been asking about him recently. Why don't you bring him in for a checkup, Sheriff? We can talk more then. But I should warn you, Buck's not the only one who's been looking for you. Someone else called about him just yesterday, asking questions about Silver Creek and Detective Morrison. Didn't give a name, but I got the feeling it wasn't a social call." Jake felt the familiar chill of danger, the same instinct that had kept him alive during his years as a detective. Buck's arrival wasn't just an impossible reunion. It was a warning that his past had finally caught up with him, and this time Emma was right in the middle of it. Jake spent the rest of the morning in his office, ostensibly working on routine paperwork while actually researching everything he could find about his old case files from Silver Creek. Buck lay under his desk, alert but relaxed, occasionally lifting his head when footsteps passed in the hallway. Emma had reluctantly gone to school after extracting a promise that Buck would still be there when she returned. Deputy Sarah Chen noticed the change in atmosphere immediately. She'd worked with Jake long enough to recognize when something had shifted in his carefully controlled world, and the presence of the German Shepherd under his desk was just the most obvious sign. "Sheriff, you want to tell me why you look like you've seen a ghost?" Sarah asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. "And why there's a police dog under your desk that wasn't here yesterday?" Jake looked up from his computer screen, where he'd been staring at decades-old news articles about corruption investigations in Silver Creek. Sarah's direct question deserved an honest answer. But honesty was a luxury Jake hadn't been able to afford in 20 years. "It's complicated," he said finally. "Most important things are." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "Jake, I've been your deputy for 5 years. In all that time, you've never brought a dog to work, never seemed rattled by anything, and never spent a morning researching old newspaper articles from cities you've never mentioned visiting. So either you're having some kind of midlife crisis, or something significant happened yesterday." Buck lifted his head at the sound of Sarah's voice, studying her with the same intense focus he'd given Jake. After a moment, he rose to his feet and approached her chair, sitting down just outside her personal space, close enough to be friendly, far enough away to avoid being threatening. "Well, hello there," Sarah said, extending her hand for Buck to sniff. "Aren't you a handsome fellow? What's your name?" "Buck," Jake said before he could stop himself. Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Buck? That's a police dog name if I ever heard one. Military training?" Jake watched as Buck allowed Sarah to scratch behind his ears, his tail wagging slightly. The dog's acceptance of her was significant. Buck had always been an excellent judge of character, and his willingness to trust Sarah told Jake something important about his deputy. "Sarah," Jake said slowly, "how much do you know about my life before I came to Dry Willow?" "Practically nothing, which has always struck me as odd for a man who's supposed to uphold the law in a small town." Sarah continued petting Buck, but her attention was focused on Jake. "Most sheriffs have a history they're happy to talk about. You've got 20 years of silence and a reluctance to discuss anything that happened before Emma was born." Jake made a decision that went against every instinct he'd developed over the past 2 decades. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the wrapped bundle containing Buck's old collar and his detective's badge. Sarah watched as he unwrapped them, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Detective Jake Morrison, Silver Creek Police Department," she read from the badge. "I take it there's a story behind why you're Sheriff Morrison now, instead of Detective Morrison." "There's a story," Jake confirmed. "The question is whether you want to hear it, knowing that it might put you in danger just by listening." Sarah looked at the badge, then at Buck, then back at Jake. "I became a cop because I believe in justice. Jake, if you're in trouble, if Emma's in trouble, then that's my business whether you want it to be or not." Over the next hour, Jake found himself telling Sarah things he'd never spoken aloud to another human being. He told her about the corruption case that had consumed his life 20 years ago, about the network of dirty cops and criminal contacts that reached all the way to the state level. He told her about Buck, about the partnership that had meant everything to him, and about the night they'd walked into an ambush that was supposed to kill them both. He told her about Sarah Morrison, the wife he'd loved and lost, and about the car bomb that had been meant for him. He told her about the decision to disappear, to take his newborn daughter and vanish into the desert where the men who'd destroyed his life would never find them. What he didn't tell her, what he wasn't ready to admit even to himself, was that Buck's appearance, after 20 years, might mean those men had found him anyway. So, Buck, here is your old partner, Sarah said when Jake finished his story. The one you thought died in that warehouse. The one I buried under an oak tree in Silver Creek, Jake confirmed. Except apparently he didn't die. Someone saved him, cared for him, and now he's here. That's not a coincidence. No, it's not. Jake looked down at Buck, who had returned to his position under the desk. Someone wanted him to find me. The question is whether that someone is trying to help me or hurt me. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, processing everything Jake had told her. Finally, she looked up at him with the kind of determined expression he'd seen on her face when dealing with difficult suspects. What do you need from me? Jake felt a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying start to lift from his shoulders. I need to find out who's been caring for Buck and why they sent him here now. And I need to make sure Emma stays safe while I figure out what's really going on. Done, Sarah said without hesitation. But Jake, if people are looking for you after all these years, we need to be smart about this. We can't investigate this alone. I can't trust anyone else, Jake said. The corruption I was investigating reached too high up the chain. For all I know, it still does. Then we'll be extra careful, Sarah replied. But we will figure this out because that little girl deserves to grow up safe. And you deserve to stop running from ghosts. Buck chose that moment to rise from under the desk and walk to the window that faced the street. He stood at attention, his ears pricked forward, staring at something Jake couldn't see. After a moment, he turned back to Jake and gave a low, warning whine. Jake joined Buck at the window and saw a dark sedan driving slowly down Main Street. It was the same car he'd noticed the night before, but now it was moving in daylight, making no effort to hide. As Jake watched, the car pulled to a stop in front of the telegraph office, and two men in suits got out. Sarah, Jake said quietly, I think we're about to find out who's been looking for me. The two men were clearly not tourists. They moved with the purposeful stride of law enforcement or military, scanning their surroundings as they approached Mrs. Patterson's building. One of them, tall, gray-haired, with the bearing of someone used to command, looked directly at the sheriff's office window. When he saw Jake watching, he smiled and raised his hand in a casual wave. Buck's warning whine became a low growl, and Jake felt 20 years of careful peace begin to crumble around him. Sarah, I need you to call the school and make sure Emma gets picked up by someone she trusts. Tell them it's a family emergency. Jake, please. Jake's voice carried the authority of a man who'd once commanded respect in dangerous situations. Those men aren't here for a social visit, and I won't risk Emma getting caught in whatever they're planning. Sarah nodded and reached for her phone, while Jake continued watching the street. The two men had split up. One was talking to Mrs. Patterson, while the other was casually examining the area around the telegraph office. Professional surveillance techniques executed with the confidence of people who knew they were being watched and didn't care. Buck pressed against Jake's leg, offering the same steady presence he'd provided 20 years ago when danger was approaching. This time, Jake wasn't going to let his partner down. It's time to find out what really happened that night, Jake murmured, his hand resting on Buck's head. And this time we're going to be ready for them. The knock on the sheriff's office door came exactly 30 minutes after Jake had seen the men arrive. Buck's ears flattened against his head, and he positioned himself between Jake and the door, a protective stance Jake remembered from their working days. Sarah had successfully arranged for Emma's early pickup from school and was now seated at her desk, her hand resting casually near her service weapon. Sheriff Morrison? The voice through the door was cultured, professional, with just a hint of authority. "Agent Thompson, FBI. I'd like to speak with you about an old case." Jake exchanged glances with Sarah, who nodded almost imperceptibly. They'd agreed that he would handle the conversation while she observed and took notes. Buck remained at Jake's side as he opened the door to reveal the grey-haired man from the street, now accompanied by a younger agent with sharp eyes and an expensive suit. "Gentlemen," Jake said, keeping his voice neutral, "what can I do for the Federal Bureau of Investigation?" Agent Thompson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "May we come in? This concerns a case from Silver Creek 20 years ago. I believe you might remember it." Jake stepped aside to allow them entry, noting how both men's gazes immediately fixed on Buck. The younger agent, who introduced himself as Agent Walsh, seemed particularly interested in the dog. "That's an impressive animal." "Sheriff," Thompson said, settling into the chair across from Jake's desk. "German Shepherd, trained for police work if I'm not mistaken. Reminds me of a dog I knew years ago, K9 unit out of Silver Creek. Buck, I think his name was. Is that so?" Jake kept his expression carefully blank, though his heart was racing. Buck had moved to lie down beside his chair, but Jake could feel the tension in the dog's body. "Yes, quite a story, actually," Thompson continued. "Buck was the partner of Detective Jake Morrison. Excellent officer, worked some very sensitive cases. Unfortunately, Detective Morrison and his dog were killed in the line of duty during a corruption investigation. Terrible loss." Sarah's pen stopped moving across her notepad. Jake felt Buck's body tense further, and he reached down to rest a calming hand on the dog's head. "I'm sorry to hear that," Jake said carefully. "But I'm not sure what this has to do with me or my jurisdiction." Agent Walsh leaned forward in his chair. "Sheriff, we have reason to believe that Detective Morrison may not have died in that warehouse 20 years ago. We think he survived, took his newborn daughter, and disappeared somewhere in the desert southwest." "That's quite a theory," Jake replied. "Do you have evidence to support it?" Thompson reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder, spreading several photographs across Jake's desk. They were surveillance photos, grainy, distant shots of Jake walking through Dry Willow with Emma, Jake at the general store, Jake outside the school. The most recent showed him kneeling beside Buck on his front porch. "These were taken over the past month," Thompson said. "We've been watching you, Sheriff Morrison. Or should I say Detective Morrison?" Jake studied the photographs without betraying any emotion, though inside he was calculating distances to weapons and exit routes. 20 years of small-town sheriffing hadn't dulled his tactical instincts. "Interesting photos," he said finally. "But I'm not sure what you're implying." "We're not implying anything," Walsh said, his voice harder than his partner's. "We're stating facts. You are Jake Morrison, former detective with the Silver Creek Police Department. That dog is Buck, your former K9 partner who was supposed to have died 20 years ago. And that little girl we've seen you with is Emma Morrison, your daughter." Buck raised his head at the mention of Emma's name, his eyes fixed on Walsh with undisguised hostility. Jake had to grip the dog's collar to keep him from rising to his feet. "Let's say, hypothetically, that you're correct," Jake said slowly. "What would the FBI want with a dead detective and his dog?" Thompson smiled again, and this time Jake saw something predatory in the expression. "The case Detective Morrison was working when he supposedly died was never closed, Sheriff. The corruption he uncovered was extensive. Police officers, judges, federal agents. Millions of dollars in drug money, evidence that disappeared, witnesses who died under suspicious circumstances." "Sounds like a complicated case," Jake observed. It was, and Detective Morrison was getting very close to identifying the people at the top of the network when he had his unfortunate accident. Thompson gathered up the photographs and returned them to his folder. Now, 20 years later, some of those same people are concerned that Detective Morrison might still be alive somewhere, possibly with evidence that could cause them significant problems. Sarah had stopped pretending to take notes and was now watching the conversation with obvious concern. Jake could see her hand moving incrementally closer to her weapon. "And what do these people want?" Jake asked. "Peace of mind," Walsh replied. They want to know that Detective Morrison really is dead, and that any evidence he might have gathered died with him. And if Detective Morrison were alive? Thompson's smile disappeared entirely. Then these people would want to correct their oversight from 20 years ago, permanently. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Buck was fully alert now, his body coiled for action, waiting for Jake's command. Jake had taught him the attack signal years ago, and he could see the dog remembered. "Gentlemen," Jake said, rising from his chair, "I think this conversation is over. If you have evidence that I've committed a crime, I'd like to see a warrant. Otherwise, you're welcome to leave my office." Thompson and Walsh exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Thompson stood as well. "Of course, Sheriff. We wouldn't want to overstay our welcome." He reached into his jacket again and pulled out a business card, placing it on Jake's desk. "In case you remember anything about Detective Morrison or his investigation. We'd be very interested to hear from you." After the agents left, Jake and Sarah sat in silence for several minutes. Buck remained alert, his attention fixed on the door as if expecting the men to return. "Jake," Sarah said finally, "those weren't FBI agents." No, they weren't. Jake picked up the business card Thompson had left behind. It looked official, but something about it felt wrong. Too perfect, too generic. Real federal agents would have come with local backup, would have followed proper procedures. These men were fishing. For what? Jake walked to the window and watched as the dark sedan pulled away from the curb. "To see if I'm really Jake Morrison, and if I have any evidence left from the Silver Creek case." "Do you?" Jake looked down at Buck, then at his deputy. "Sarah, I need you to do something for me. I need you to pick up Emma from wherever she is and take her somewhere safe. Somewhere these men can't find her. What are you going to do?" Jake opened his desk drawer and pulled out Buck's old collar and his detective badge. After 20 years of hiding, it was time to remember who he used to be. "I'm going to find out who sent Buck to me and why. And then I'm going to finish what I started 20 years ago." That evening, Jake drove the 40 miles to Dr. Henley's veterinary clinic with Buck beside him in the passenger seat. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, painted gold and crimson by the setting sun. Emma was safe with Sarah at the deputy's ranch outside town. Though it had taken considerable, persuasion to convince his daughter that she needed to spend the night away from home, Dr. Henley turned out to be a man in his 70s with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime spent caring for animals. His clinic was small but well-equipped, and he greeted Buck like an old friend. "Well, look who's finally come home," Dr. Henley said, running his hands over Buck's coat with professional thoroughness. "He's aged well, considering. Good muscle tone, clear eyes. Whoever's been caring for him knew what they were doing." "Tell me about the man who brought him to you 20 years ago," Jake said, settling into a chair in the examination room. Buck submitted patiently to the veterinarian's examination, though he kept one eye on Jake at all times. "Captain Frank Rawlings," Dr. Henley replied without hesitation. "Drove up here in the middle of the night with this fellow bleeding all over his back seat. Said his detective had been killed and asked me to do whatever I could to save his partner." Jake's blood chilled. Frank Rawlings had been his captain in Silver Creek, the man who'd assigned him to the corruption case and who'd visited him in the hospital after the warehouse shooting. Frank was also the one who'd told him Buck was dead and suggested he leave town for his own safety. "Frank never told me he'd saved Buck," Jake said quietly. "From what he told me, he wasn't supposed to," Dr. Henley replied. "Said there were people who needed to believe the dog was dead, same as they needed to believe you were dead. He was protecting both of you. Where's Frank now?" Dr. Henley paused in his examination, his expression growing troubled. "That's where things get complicated, Sheriff. Frank's been checking on Buck regularly for 20 years. Calls every few months, sends money for veterinary bills, arranges for his care. But 3 months ago, the calls stopped." Jake felt his chest tighten. "What happened 3 months ago?" "Don't know for certain, but around that same time, other people started asking questions about Buck. People who claimed to be federal agents. People who wanted to know where the dog came from and who'd been caring for him. The fake agents, Thompson and Walsh." Jake was beginning to understand the timeline. someone had discovered. Frank was alive and caring for Buck, which led them to start looking for Jake as well. Dr. Henley, I need you to tell me everything Frank told you about what happened that night in Silver Creek. The veterinarian finished his examination and gave Buck a treat from his pocket. The dog accepted it graciously, but remained focused on Jake. Frank said you and Buck had stumbled onto something bigger than anyone realized. The corruption case you were working, it wasn't just local police taking drug money. It was a network that reached into federal agencies, state government, even some judges and prosecutors. I suspected as much, Jake said. We'd found connections between several cases, patterns that suggested coordination at a high level. Frank said the warehouse was a setup. Someone leaked your location to the people you were investigating, and they decided to eliminate the problem permanently. You were supposed to die that night, along with Buck and any evidence you'd gathered. Jake remembered the ambush, the way the gunmen had known exactly where he and Buck would be, the professional efficiency of the attack. They'd walked into a kill zone, and only luck and Buck's warning had kept them alive long enough for backup to arrive. But we didn't die, Jake said. No, but Frank had to make it look like you did. He falsified the reports, buried Buck's survival, and helped you disappear with your daughter. He said it was the only way to keep you safe until he could figure out how deep the corruption went. And now, Frank's missing. Dr. Henley nodded gravely. 3 months ago, he called and said he was going to make contact with someone who might be able to help clean up the mess in Silver Creek. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure Buck found his way to you. Jake looked down at his old partner, understanding finally settling over him. Buck hadn't just wandered into Dry Willow by accident. He'd been sent there by a dying man's final gift of loyalty. Dr. Henley, did Frank leave anything else? Any message, any evidence? The veterinarian walked to a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick envelope marked with Buck's name. He left this 6 months ago, said to give it to you if Buck ever made it home. Jake's hands trembled as he opened the envelope. Inside were documents he recognized. Copies of his original case files from Silver Creek, witness statements, financial records, and photographs. But there were also new materials, surveillance photos, bank records, and what looked like 20 years' worth of additional investigation. Frank hadn't just helped Jake disappear. He'd continued working. The case in secret for 2 decades, a handwritten note on police department letterhead, was clipped to the front of the documents. Jake, if you're reading this, then something's happened to me and Buck made it to you safely. I never stopped investigating what happened that night. The corruption was worse than we thought, but I've got evidence now that can bring them down. The problem is, they know I'm alive and they're coming for me. They'll come for you too once they realize Buck found you. The man you want is Senator Richard Hayes. He was the prosecutor who buried our case 20 years ago. He's been protecting the network ever since. The evidence is all here, but you'll need help getting it to the right people. Trust Deputy Chen. I've been watching your town for years and she's clean. Take care of yourself and that beautiful daughter of yours. And Jake, finish what we started. Frank, Jake felt tears he'd been holding back for 20 years finally break free. Frank Rawlings had spent 2 decades of his life protecting Jake and Emma, continuing the investigation that had cost them so much. And now he'd paid the ultimate price for that loyalty. Buck moved closer and rested his head on Jake's knee, offering the same comfort he'd provided so many years ago. Jake stroked the dog's graying fur and made a promise he should have made 20 years earlier. We're going to finish this, partner. For Frank, for Sarah, for Emma, we're going to make sure those bastards finally pay for what they did. Dr. Henley cleared his throat gently. Sheriff, there's one more thing. Frank left instructions about Buck's training records. Seems your partner here has capabilities you might not remember or might not have known about in the first place. Jake looked up from the documents, suddenly alert. What kind of capabilities? The veterinarian smiled for the first time since Jake had arrived. Let's just say Buck's training went beyond standard police K9 work. Frank thought you might need every advantage you could get when the time came to fight back. Buck's tail wagged once, and Jake could have sworn the dog was smiling. After 20 years of hiding, it was time for Detective Jake Morrison and his partner to go back to work. Jake drove back to Dry Willow through the desert darkness, with Frank's evidence on the seat beside him and 20 years of suppressed memories flooding back. Buck sat alert in the passenger seat, occasionally turning to check the road behind them. The dog's vigilance reminded Jake that they were no longer just running from the past. They were being hunted by people who had already killed once to keep their secrets safe. Sarah's ranch was a modest spread 5 miles outside town, hidden behind a grove of cottonwood trees that provided natural cover from the main road. Jake found Sarah and Emma sitting on the front porch, sharing a dinner of sandwiches and watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. "Papa!" Emma jumped up and ran to hug him, Buck close behind her. "Sarah says we're having a sleepover because of work stuff, but she won't tell me what kind of work stuff keeps us away from our own house." Jake knelt down to Emma's level, his hands resting on her shoulders. At 9 years old, she was already too smart for simple explanations, and he could see questions forming in her intelligent eyes. "Sweetheart, remember how I told you that sometimes grown-ups have to deal with complicated problems from long ago?" Emma nodded, her expression serious. "Well, some of those problems have found us here in Dry Willow. Sarah and I need to work together to solve them, and while we do that, I need you to stay somewhere safe." "Is it because of the men who came to your office today?" Emma asked. "Mrs. Patterson said they looked like the kind of men who ask questions, but don't answer any." Jake exchanged glances with Sarah over Emma's head. His daughter had inherited her mother's intuition along with her intelligence. "Something like that," Jake said carefully. "But I want you to know that Sarah and I are going to take care of everything. You don't need to be scared." Emma studied his face in the porch light, and Jake could see her mother's perceptive nature in her steady gaze. "Papa, are you scared?" The question caught Jake off guard with its directness. He'd spent 20 years trying to shield Emma from the harsh realities of his past, but now that past was demanding acknowledgement. "A little," he admitted. "But sometimes being scared helps us be more careful and more determined to protect the people we love." Emma nodded, as if this made perfect sense to her, then turned her attention to Buck. "At least Buck is here to help us. He's very smart, isn't he? I taught him to shake hands today, and Sarah says he knows lots of other tricks too." "Buck is very smart," Jake agreed, watching as his daughter demonstrated the dog's responsiveness to hand signals. Buck sat, lay down, and rolled over at Emma's gestures. But Jake noticed the dog was also responding to subtle cues Emma probably wasn't even aware she was giving. Buck's training was more extensive than Jake had realized. After Emma went to bed in Sarah's spare room, Jake and Sarah spread Frank's documents across the kitchen table. 20 years of patient investigation lay before them. Bank records, surveillance photos, witness statements, and a web of connections that painted a picture of corruption more extensive than Jake had ever imagined. "Jesus." "Jake," Sarah breathed, studying a financial report that showed money flowing from drug seizures into a network of private accounts. "This goes all the way to Washington." "Frank suspected as much," Jake replied, pointing to a photograph of Senator Richard Hayes shaking hands with known criminals. Hayes was the prosecutor who shut down our original investigation. He claimed we didn't have enough evidence, but really he was protecting his own people. Sarah picked up another document, a list of names that included police officers, federal agents, judges, and politicians. Some of the names had been crossed out in red ink, with dates written beside them. "What do the dates mean?" she asked. Jake felt his stomach clench as he recognized the pattern. "Those are people who tried to expose the network over the years. The dates are when they died: car accidents, heart attacks, suicides, house fires. All very convenient and all very permanent. Frank's name is on this list," Sarah said quietly. "With a date from 3 months ago." Jake nodded, grief and anger warring in his chest. Frank Rawlings had spent 20 years trying to bring justice to the people who destroyed Jake's life, and it had finally cost him everything. Buck raised his head from where he'd been lying by the door, his ears pricked forward in alertness. Jake recognized the warning signal and immediately moved to the window, peering out into the darkness surrounding Sarah's ranch. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her hand moving to her weapon. "Buck's picked up something," Jake replied, studying the tree line for any sign of movement. Could be an animal, but the soft ping of a bullet hitting the window frame next to Jake's head cut off his words. Jake threw himself to the floor, pulling Sarah down with him as more shots shattered the kitchen windows. "Emma!" Sarah started to rise, but Jake held her down. "But God!" Jake commanded, and the German shepherd immediately bounded toward Emma's room. Jake could hear his daughter's frightened cry as Buck's barking filled the house. "Sarah, we need to get to Emma and get out of here," Jake said, crawling toward the hallway as bullets continued to pepper the front of the house. "They've found us." Sarah nodded, drawing her service weapon and following Jake toward the bedrooms. They found Emma sitting up in bed, wide-eyed but not panicked, with Buck positioned between her and the window. "Papa, there are bad men outside," Emma said with the matter-of-fact tone of a child who was learning to adapt quickly to dangerous situations. "I know, sweetheart. We're going to leave through the back door and go to the barn. Sarah's truck is there." Jake scooped Emma into his arms, while Sarah grabbed the evidence from the kitchen table. Buck led the way through the house, checking corners and doorways with professional thoroughness. At the back door, he paused and gave a low whine, 2 quick pulses that Jake remembered as the signal for multiple hostiles. "They've surrounded the house," Jake translated for Sarah. "We'll have to make a run for it," Sarah nodded grimly. "On 3. I'll cover. You and Emma head for the barn. Buck goes with you," Jake instructed his partner. "Protect Emma." Buck's acknowledgement was a single sharp bark. Jake took a deep breath, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that had carried him through dangerous situations 20 years ago. 1, 2, 3. They burst through the back door into chaos. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as men in tactical gear opened fire from positions around the ranch. Sarah returned fire while Jake ran for the barn with Emma in his arms, Buck racing alongside them. A bullet whistled past Jake's ear, and he felt Emma press her face against his shoulder. "It's okay, baby," he said, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "We're almost there." They reached the barn as Sarah's truck engine roared to life. Buck leaped into the truck bed, while Jake secured Emma in the passenger seat. Sarah sliding behind the wheel with practiced efficiency. "Hold on," Sarah said, and gunned the engine toward the ranch's back gate. As they bounced across the rough ground, Jake looked back to see the ranch house erupting in flames. 20 years of hiding were over. The war he'd been trying to avoid had finally found him and his daughter, but this time Jake Morrison wasn't running away. This time he was going to fight back. They drove through the desert for 2 hours, taking back roads and ranch paths that Sarah knew from her years patrolling the county. Emma had fallen asleep despite the adrenaline, her head resting against Jake's shoulder, while Buck maintained watch from the truck bed. Finally, Sarah pulled into an abandoned gas station 50 miles from Dry Willow, hidden behind a cluster of weathered billboards. "We should be safe here for a few hours," Sarah said, turning off the engine. "This place has been closed for 10 years, but the owner still pays for electricity. We can rest and figure out our next move." Jake carried Emma inside, while Sarah swept the small building for threats. Buck followed close behind, his nose working to catalog the unfamiliar scents. They settled Emma on an old couch in what had been the office, covering her with Sarah's jacket. "Jake," Sarah said quietly, studying the documents from Frank's investigation. "There's something here that doesn't make sense." Jake looked up from where he'd been checking Buck for injuries from their escape. The dog was fine, alert, and ready for whatever came next. "What do you mean?" Sarah spread out several pages on the dusty counter. "These bank records Frank collected. They show money flowing from drug seizures into private accounts. But look at the dates." Jake examined the documents, his detective instincts engaging despite his exhaustion. The financial trail showed millions of dollars moving through a network of shell companies and private accounts over the past 20 years. The money didn't stop flowing after you disappeared, Sarah continued. If anything, it increased. Whatever network you were investigating, it didn't just survive your supposed death, it expanded. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night, which means the corruption case was just the beginning. We stumbled onto something much bigger. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a series of transactions from the past 5 years. Government contracts, defense spending, homeland security funding. Jake, this isn't just about drug money anymore. Someone's been using the network you discovered to siphon money from federal programs. Jake studied the documents more carefully, his trained eye picking out patterns and connections. What Frank had uncovered in 20 years of investigation was staggering, a conspiracy that had grown from local police corruption into a massive federal fraud scheme. "The men who came for us tonight," Jake said slowly, "they weren't just trying to silence me about the original case. They're protecting something much bigger." Sarah nodded grimly. "And Buck finding you wasn't just about Frank keeping a promise. Someone wanted you to have this evidence." Buck raised his head at the sound of his name, then rose and walked to the window facing the parking lot. His body language shifted from relaxed to alert, and he gave a soft whine that Jake recognized as a warning. "We've got company," Jake said, moving to join Buck at the window. A single vehicle was approaching through the darkness, not the tactical team that had attacked the ranch, but a lone sedan moving slowly and deliberately. As it drew closer, Jake could see it was an older model, dented and dusty from desert travel. The car stopped 50 yards from the gas station and a figure got out. Even in the darkness, Jake recognized the careful, measured movements of someone trained in law enforcement. The man approached with his hands visible, calling out as he walked, "Sheriff Morrison, my name is Agent David Park, FBI. I'm alone, and I'm here to help." Jake's hand moved to his weapon, but Buck's body language told a different story. The dog was alert but not aggressive, curious rather than defensive. "Stay with Emma," Jake told Sarah, then called out through the window. "Agent Park, I've had enough federal visitors for one day. What makes you different?" The man stopped about 20 feet from the building, well within the light spilling from the windows. He was Asian American, maybe 40, with the lean build of someone who stayed in shape but wasn't trying to intimidate anyone. Most importantly, he kept his hands where Jake could see them. "Because I'm the agent Frank Rawlings contacted 3 months ago," Park called back. "And because I've been investigating Senator Hayes and his network for the past 2 years, waiting for someone with enough evidence to help me bring them down." Jake exchanged glances with Sarah, who nodded toward the documents spread across the counter. If Park was legitimate, he might be their only chance to get Frank's evidence to the right people. "How do I know you're really FBI?" Jake asked. Park reached slowly into his jacket and pulled out what looked like a cell phone. "I'm going to call my supervisor at the Phoenix field office. You can listen to the entire conversation." The phone call that followed was either the most elaborate setup Jake had ever encountered or proof that Agent Park was exactly what he claimed to be. Jake listened as Park spoke to his supervisor about the Morrison case, the Hayes investigation, and the need for immediate federal protection. "Agent Park," Jake called out when the call ended, "if you're really here to help, you'll understand why I need some proof before I trust you with my daughter's life." Park nodded and reached into his jacket again, this time producing a thick folder. He placed it on the ground and stepped back. "In that folder, you'll find everything I know about Frank Rawlings' investigation, including the last message he sent me before he disappeared. There's also information about Buck that Frank thought you should know, information about his training that goes beyond standard police K-9 work." Jake looked at Buck, who was now staring at the folder with intense focus. The dog's reaction suggested he recognized something about the documents or their scent. "Sarah, cover me," Jake said, then stepped outside to retrieve the folder. Buck followed him, staying close but showing no signs of aggression toward Agent Park. Back inside, Jake opened the folder and felt his understanding of the situation shift once again. The documents showed that Buck hadn't just been a police K-9. He'd been part of a classified federal program that trained dogs for counterintelligence operations. His capabilities included detecting electronic surveillance equipment, identifying chemical traces from explosives and drugs, and executing complex tactical maneuvers. "Frank never told me," Jake said, looking down at Buck with new respect. "All these years I thought you were just the best police dog I'd ever worked with." Buck's response was to walk over to the documents. Sarah had spread out and used his nose to point to specific pages. financial records that showed payments to a company called Specialized Canine Training Solutions. He's telling us something, Sarah. Observed, Jake studied the records Buck had indicated, then looked up at Agent Park, who had remained outside but was watching through the window. Agent Park. Is Buck's training why Frank contacted you? Park nodded. Frank realized that Buck's specialized training made him valuable to the same people who killed your wife and tried to kill you. They've been looking for him for 20 years, not just to eliminate a witness, but to recover a federal asset. Jake felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The fake FBI agents who visited me, they weren't just trying to confirm I was alive. They were looking for Buck. The program that trained Buck was shut down 15 years ago when it was discovered that some of its assets had been sold to criminal organizations, Park explained. Senator Hayes was the Oversight Committee chair who buried the investigation. Buck represents evidence that could expose not just the original corruption, but 15 years of cover-up. Emma stirred on the couch, opening her eyes and looking around the unfamiliar room.
Papa, where are we?
Jake went to his daughter, helping her sit up while Buck moved to her side. We're somewhere safe, sweetheart. There's a nice man outside who's going to help us solve those complicated problems I told you about. Emma studied Jake's face, then looked at Buck, then at the documents scattered around the room. Papa, are you a detective again? The question hit Jake with unexpected force. For 20 years, he'd been Sheriff Morrison, the man who kept the peace in a quiet desert town. But tonight, surrounded by evidence and facing the conspiracy that had destroyed his life, he felt like Detective Jake Morrison for the first time since Buck's supposed death. I think I am, sweetheart, he said quietly. Is that okay with you? Emma considered this seriously, then nodded. If Buck thinks it's okay, then I think it's okay too. Jake looked down at his old partner, who was watching both of them with those intelligent brown eyes. Buck's tail wagged once, and Jake knew they were ready to finish what they'd started 20 years ago. The only question now was whether they could survive long enough to see justice done. Dawn painted the desert in shades of gold and amber as Jake, Sarah, Emma, and Agent Park huddled around a camp table inside the abandoned gas station, planning their next move. Buck lay nearby, alert and watchful, occasionally lifting his head when distant sounds carried on the morning wind. The evidence from Frank's 20-year investigation was spread before them like pieces of a massive jigsaw puzzle, finally forming a picture of corruption that reached from Silver Creek to Washington, D.C. Agent Park had spent the night on the phone with his contacts at the FBI, arranging for a task force to move against Senator Hayes and his network. But the logistics were complicated. Too many people in positions of authority were potentially compromised, and any premature move could result in evidence being destroyed and witnesses disappearing. The problem is scale, Park explained, pointing to a chart showing the network's connections. Hayes has been building this organization for over 20 years. He's got people in federal agencies, state government, local police departments, and private security firms. If we move against him directly, he'll know we're coming long before we can gather enough evidence to make charges stick. Emma sat quietly at the table, coloring in a book Sarah had found in the gas station's convenience section. But Jake could tell she was listening to every word, her intelligent mind processing information that most children her age would never have to consider. So, what do you suggest? Sarah asked, studying satellite photos of what appeared to be a fortified compound in the mountains north of Silver Creek. We need to get Hayes to come to us, Park replied. Make him think he's won, that he's finally eliminated the last threat to his operation. Jake looked up from the tactical plans he'd been sketching. 20 years of small-town sheriffing hadn't dulled his strategic thinking. And he could see what Park was suggesting. You want to use me as bait, not just you, Park said, glancing at Buck. Hayes doesn't just want you dead, he wants Buck back. The dog represents millions of dollars in training and capabilities that Hayes thinks belong to him. Plus, Buck knows things about the original investigation that could destroy people who are still in power. Buck raised his head at the mention of his name. and Jake could see intelligence in those brown eyes that went beyond normal canine awareness. The dog seemed to understand they were discussing him, and more importantly, he seemed ready for whatever role he might play. "What exactly are Buck's capabilities?" Jake asked. "Frank's files mention specialized training, but they don't go into detail." Park smiled for the first time since they'd met. "Buck isn't just trained to detect drugs and explosives. He can identify electronic surveillance equipment, track specific chemical signatures across miles of terrain, and execute tactical operations that most human operatives couldn't manage. The program that created him was developing dogs that could work independently behind enemy lines." Jake looked down at Buck with new understanding. "That's how you found me in Dry Willow, isn't it? You tracked my scent across 20 years and 200 miles. Buck's tail wagged once, and Jake could have sworn the dog was acknowledging the compliment. Emma looked up from her coloring book, her expression thoughtful. "Papa, if Buck is so special, why do the bad men want him back? Couldn't they just train another dog?" It was Agent Park who answered, his voice gentle but serious. "The program that trained Buck was shut down, Emma. All the records were destroyed, and the people who knew how to do that kind of training are either dead or in hiding. Buck might be the last of his kind. So he's like a treasure," Emma said, her 9-year-old mind grasping the concept immediately. "And the bad men think they can steal him." "Something like that," Jake said, resting his hand on his daughter's shoulder. "But Buck gets to choose who his family is, and he's already chosen us." Sarah had been studying the tactical plans while they talked, her law enforcement training evident in the questions she was asking. "Agent Park, if we're going to draw Hayes out, we need to make sure Emma is somewhere completely safe. This isn't going to be a simple arrest. It's going to be a war." "Already arranged," Park replied. "I have a safe house in Phoenix with a team of agents who specialize in protecting witnesses. Emma will be completely secure until this is over." Emma's head snapped up from her coloring book, her expression shifting from curiosity to alarm. "No, I'm not leaving Papa and Buck." Jake knelt beside his daughter's chair, taking her small hands in his larger ones. "Sweetheart, this is going to be very dangerous. The bad men who came to Sarah's ranch last night, there are going to be more of them. And they're not going to stop until someone makes them stop. Then I want to help make them stop," Emma said, with a determination that reminded Jake painfully of her mother. "Buck chose me too, didn't you, Buck?" The German shepherd rose from his position by the door and walked over to Emma, resting his head on her lap in a gesture of unmistakable loyalty. Emma's hand found the spot behind his ears that he liked best, and Buck's eyes closed in contentment. "You see," Emma said to the adults around the table, "we're a team. Teams don't split up when things get scary." Agent Park looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Sheriff Morrison, I can't authorize a 9-year-old to participate in a federal operation against armed criminals." "And I won't put my daughter in danger," Jake replied. "But Emma makes a good point. If we separate now, Hayes wins, regardless of what happens to the rest of us." Sarah leaned forward in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "What if we could find a way to keep Emma safe while still keeping the family together? Somewhere Hayes wouldn't expect to find you, but where Emma could stay with people she trusts?" Jake considered this, his mind working through possibilities. After 20 years of hiding, he'd learned to think several moves ahead of potential threats. "The people of Dry Willow," he said slowly. "They've been my neighbors for 20 years. They trust me and they care about Emma. If I ask them to help protect her while I deal with Hayes, they'd do it." "You want to turn a small desert town into a fortress?" Park asked, his eyebrows rising. "I want to give Hayes what he thinks he wants, a showdown in territory he can control," Jake replied. "Except it won't be territory he controls. It'll be my territory, with my people, fighting for something they believe in." Emma clapped her hands together, her face lighting up with excitement. "Like the movies where the good guys make a stand in their hometown." "Something like that," Jake said, though he was thinking more about the tactical advantages of fighting on familiar ground with local support. Buck had moved to the window and was staring out at the desert, with the focused attention Jake recognized as a warning. The dog's body language suggested vehicles approaching from the south, the direction they'd come from the night before. "We've got company," Jake announced. Moving to join Buck at the window, Agent Park was immediately alert, his hand moving to his weapon. "How many?" Buck's response was a series of soft whines, in a pattern Jake remembered from their old partnership. "3 vehicles, multiple occupants, approaching with tactical spacing. Hayes found us faster than I expected," Park said grimly. "We need to move now." "No," Jake said, studying the approaching vehicles through binoculars he'd found in the gas station. "This is our chance to send Hayes a message, to let him know that Detective Jake Morrison is back in business." Sarah was already checking her weapon and gathering the evidence files. "Jake, we can't fight a tactical team with 3 people and a dog, no matter how well trained the dog is." "We're not going to fight them," Jake replied, his mind racing through the possibilities. "We're going to give them something to think about." He turned to Buck, who was watching him with that intelligent gaze. "Buck, remember the diversion protocols from the old days?" Buck's tail wagged once and Jake could see recognition in the dog's eyes. "Agent Park, how long do you need to get the evidence to your people?" "If I can reach my car, I can upload everything to a secure server in 10 minutes. Jake nodded, then knelt beside Emma, who was watching the approaching vehicles with more curiosity than fear. "Sweetheart, I need you to do something very important for me. I need you to take care of Buck, while Sarah and Agent Park get the evidence to safety." "What are you going to do, Papa?" Jake looked out at the desert, where 3 carloads of armed men were preparing to attack a gas station containing everyone he cared about in the world. For 20 years, he'd run from this confrontation. Now finally, it was time to stop running. "I'm going to remind some very bad people why they were afraid of Detective Jake Morrison in the first place." Buck moved to stand beside Jake, and together they prepared to face the storm that was about to break over their small piece of the desert. Behind them, Emma clutched Sarah's hand while Agent Park prepared to upload 20 years of carefully gathered evidence to the federal task force that would finally bring Senator Hayes and his network to justice. The war Jake had been avoiding for 2 decades was about to begin. But this time he wasn't facing it alone. This time he had his partner back, his family safe, and allies who believed in the same justice he'd spent his life fighting for. Hayes and his men were about to learn that some ghosts from the past were very much alive and ready to fight back. The attack came with the precision of a military operation. 3 black SUVs approached the gas station from different angles, their occupants moving with the coordinated efficiency of professionals who had done this many times before. Jake watched through the grimy window as men in tactical gear deployed from the vehicles, establishing a perimeter that cut off every escape route. 12 hostiles, Jake said quietly, his detective instincts automatically cataloging threats. Standard tactical formation, but they're being careful not to get too close too fast. "They want us alive." Agent Park was hunched over his laptop, uploading Frank's evidence to the FBI servers with desperate urgency. 60% complete, he muttered. "I need 5 more minutes." Sarah had positioned herself near the back door with her service weapon drawn, her eyes scanning for any movement in their blind spots. Emma sat on the floor beside Buck, her small arms wrapped around the dog's neck in a gesture that was both protective and seeking protection. "Papa," Emma whispered. "Are those the same bad men from last night?" Jake studied the approaching figures through his binoculars. These men moved differently than the team that had attacked Sarah's ranch. More disciplined, more patient, more dangerous. "Different team," he said, "but working for the same bad people." Buck's attention was focused on the largest group of attackers positioned near the front of the building. His body language suggested he was ready to act on Jake's command, but waiting for the right moment. "Detective Morrison!" The voice came through a bullhorn, electronically amplified and professionally calm. "My name is Colonel Marcus Webb. I'm here to offer you a deal." Jake recognized the voice, not personally, but the type. Military contractor, probably Special Forces background, now working private security for people with unlimited budgets and flexible morals. "I'm listening, Colonel," Jake called back. "You have something that belongs to my employer." Return it, along with any copies of classified materials you may have obtained, and we'll allow you and your family to leave unharmed." Jake looked down at Buck, who was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes. The dog's specialized training had made him valuable to criminal organizations, but his loyalty belonged to Jake and Emma now. "The dog isn't property, Colonel. He's family." There was a pause before Webb's response came through the bullhorn. "Detective Morrison, you have 5 minutes to reconsider. After that, we'll be forced to take a more aggressive approach." Agent Park looked up from his laptop, sweat beading on his forehead. 80% complete. Just a little more time. Sarah had moved to a position where she could cover both the front and back entrances. "Jake, they've got us surrounded and outgunned. Even if Buck is as well-trained as Agent Park says, we can't fight our way out of this." Jake was thinking the same thing, but his mind was working on a different problem. Webb's team was positioned like they expected a traditional siege situation. Cornered suspects who would either surrender or fight desperately from a fixed position. "Buck," Jake said quietly, "show me tactical dispersion protocol." Buck immediately moved to the center of the room and sat at attention, his gaze fixed on Jake. Then, with movements so subtle they were barely visible, the dog began indicating positions throughout the building, using tiny shifts of his head and eyes. Jake followed Buck's guidance, understanding dawning as he realized what his partner was showing him. The dog had mapped every sightline, every potential firing position, every weakness in their attacker's formation during the few minutes they'd been watching. "He's been conducting reconnaissance," Jake said with amazement. "Buck's been analyzing their tactical deployment and developing countermeasures." Emma looked up from where she'd been staying low beside the counter. "Buck's really smart, Papa. I think he has a plan." Jake knelt beside Buck, running his hand through the dog's graying fur while studying the tactical situation through new eyes. Buck wasn't just a trained police dog. He was a strategic asset with capabilities that went far beyond anything Jake had imagined. "Agent Park, how much more time do you need?" 3 minutes, maybe 4. Jake looked at Sarah, then at Emma, then back at Buck. His partner was waiting patiently for orders, ready to execute whatever plan Jake decided on. 20 years ago, Jake had trusted Buck with his life during the warehouse ambush. Now he was being asked to make that same trust again, but this time Emma's life was part of the equation. "Colonel Webb," Jake called out, "I need to discuss your offer with my team. Give me 2 more minutes to make a decision." "You have 2 minutes, Detective Morrison. After that, we come in." Buck moved to the window and gave a soft whine, a signal that meant movement in the perimeter. The tactical team was tightening their formation. Preparing for the final phase of their operation, Jake made a decision that went against every protective instinct he'd developed as a father, but aligned perfectly with his training as a detective who trusted his partner completely. "Buck," he said quietly, "initiate tactical dispersion. Priority 1, protect Emma. Priority 2, buy Agent Park time to complete his upload. Priority 3, neutralize hostile assets." Buck's acknowledgement was a single, sharp bark that somehow managed to convey both understanding and determination. Then the dog that had been Jake's partner 20 years ago transformed into the tactical asset he'd been trained to be, the final phase of Detective Jake Morrison's 20-year quest for justice was about to begin. What happened next redefined Jake's understanding of what was possible. Buck didn't charge directly at the attackers or engage in the dramatic heroics of movie dogs. Instead, he executed a series of movements so precise and purposeful that Jake realized he was watching a master tactician at work. First, Buck triggered the gas station's ancient electrical system, using his teeth to pull specific wires in the utility room. The building's lights went out in sequence, but not randomly, in a pattern that created alternating zones of darkness and illumination that favored defensive positions over attacking ones. Then Buck moved to the building's ventilation system, somehow activating fans and airflow patterns that would carry sound away from Agent Park's position while amplifying noises from other areas. Within seconds, the acoustic landscape of the building had been transformed into a tactical advantage. How is he doing that? Sarah whispered, watching in amazement as Buck manipulated their environment with surgical precision. 20 years of specialized training, Jake replied, but he was equally astounded by his partner's capabilities. Buck's turning this building into a fortress. Emma remained calm, despite the chaos unfolding around her, her small hand resting on Buck's back whenever he passed her position. The dog would pause for a split second each time, as if drawing strength from her touch, then continue his tactical preparations. "Upload complete," Agent Park announced. "The evidence is in federal hands. Whatever happens here, Hayes and his network are finished." Colonel Webb's voice crackled through the bullhorn. "Time's up, Detective Morrison. We're coming in." The assault began immediately, with tactical teams moving toward 3 different entry points simultaneously. But Buck had anticipated this, and as the first attacker reached the front door, the dog triggered another system. The building's old fire suppression sprinklers. Water cascaded from the ceiling in specific areas, creating pools that reflected the remaining light sources and turned solid footing into slippery uncertainty. The attacker's night vision equipment, calibrated for dry conditions, became less effective in the shifting patterns of light and water. Jake found himself in the surreal position of following his dog's lead in a tactical situation. Buck would move to a position, look back at Jake meaningfully, then indicate where Jake should take cover or which angles he should watch. It was like having a strategic mind that could process battlefield conditions faster than any human commander. "Papa, Buck wants you by the window," Emma said, somehow interpreting the dog's subtle communications with the intuitive understanding of a child who had bonded completely with an animal. Jake moved to where Buck had indicated, just as the first tactical team breached the front entrance. From his new position, Jake had a clear view of their approach route and excellent cover from return fire. Buck had positioned him perfectly. Sarah was in her own optimal position, guided by Buck's tactical analysis to a spot where she could cover the back entrance while remaining protected from crossfire. Agent Park had been directed to the most secure location in the building, surrounded by structural elements that would stop high-caliber rounds. The battle that followed was unlike anything Jake had experienced in 20 years of law enforcement. Buck moved through the building like a phantom, appearing behind attackers to distract them at precisely the moment Jake or Sarah needed to change positions. The dog never attacked directly, but his presence created confusion and hesitation among men who were trained to handle human opponents, not canine tactical officers. "Delta Team, report." Webb's voice crackled over radio communications Jake could intercept from dropped equipment. "We've got the building surrounded, but they're not where they're supposed to be," came the confused response. "It's like they're reading our movements before we make them." Jake smiled grimly as he realized what Buck was doing. The dog was using his enhanced senses to detect the attacker's movements, then positioning the defenders to take advantage of every tactical mistake before the attackers realized they'd made one. Emma remained in the center of the building, exactly where Buck had placed her, the most protected spot in the entire structure. She was calm, almost serene, as if she understood that she was being watched over by forces beyond her father's weapon and her own courage. "Colonel Webb," Jake called out during a lull in the gunfire. "Your tactical advantage isn't as overwhelming as you thought. Maybe it's time to reconsider your approach." The response came not through the bullhorn, but through actions. Webb's team began a coordinated assault on all entry points simultaneously, abandoning stealth for overwhelming firepower. But Buck had anticipated this too. As the attackers committed fully to their assault, the dog triggered his final tactical preparation, a series of small explosions in the building's old propane system that created clouds of obscuring smoke without causing structural damage. In the chaos that followed, Jake heard Webb shouting orders to his men. "Fall back! Regroup at the vehicles. We need a different approach." As the smoke cleared, Jake found himself looking out at tactical vehicles retreating into the desert. Buck had not only defended their position, He had forced a professional military unit to withdraw from a target they'd expected to take easily. Agent Park emerged from his secure position with his laptop, confirming that the federal task force was already moving against Hayes and his associates. Sarah was unharmed and amazed by what she'd witnessed. Emma walked over to Buck, who was panting slightly from his exertions, but otherwise seemed pleased with the results of his tactical operations. "Good boy, Buck," she said, scratching behind his ears. "You protected our family." Jake knelt beside his daughter and his partner, overwhelmed by gratitude and pride. After 20 years of separation, he and Buck had worked together again, and this time they'd won. 6 months later, Sheriff Jake Morrison sat on his front porch in Dry Willow, watching the desert sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of gold and amber. Buck lay beside his chair, graying muzzle resting on crossed paws, alert but relaxed in the evening warmth. Emma was in the yard, training Buck's newest companion, a young German shepherd puppy the FBI had given them as a gesture of gratitude for their service. The past half-year had been a whirlwind of federal investigations, congressional hearings, and media attention that Jake could have done without. Senator Richard Hayes was now serving a life sentence in federal prison, along with dozens of his co-conspirators. The corruption network that had destroyed Jake's first life and cost so many people their lives had finally been dismantled, piece by piece, using the evidence Frank Rawlings had spent 20 years gathering. Frank himself had been found alive, barely, in a medical facility in Mexico, where Hayes's people had been keeping him sedated and imprisoned. He was recovering slowly but steadily, and had visited Dry Willow twice to see Buck and meet the daughter Jake had protected so carefully. "You know," Frank had said during his last visit, "I always wondered if I did the right thing, helping you disappear like that." Looking at Emma, seeing how you've raised her. "I know I did. Deputy Sarah Chen, now Sheriff Sarah Chen, having been elected to replace Jake when he decided to retire from law." Enforcement walked up the porch steps with a folder of papers and a cup of coffee. "The federal prosecutors want you to testify in the Hayes case one more time," she said, settling into the chair beside Jake. "Something about finalizing the asset forfeiture proceedings." Jake accepted the folder, but didn't open it immediately. He'd testified enough for 3 lifetimes over the past 6 months, helping to ensure that everyone who'd profited from the corruption network faced justice. "How much more can there be to say?" he asked. "They've got Frank's evidence, Agent Park's investigation, and Buck's specialized training records. The case is solid." "It's not about the strength of the case," Sarah replied. "It's about making sure every loose end is tied up, every victim gets justice, and every dollar of stolen money goes back where it belongs." Emma looked up from where she was teaching the puppy basic commands. At 10 years old, she had grown into her intelligence and curiosity, asking questions about the world that sometimes surprised the adults around her. "Papa, when you go to testify, can Buck come with you?" He was part of solving the case too. Jake smiled, remembering the media sensation Buck had caused when his role in the investigation became public. "Tactical genius dog helps solve 20-year conspiracy" had been one of the more restrained headlines. Buck had handled the attention with the same patient dignity he brought to everything else, though he clearly preferred the quiet of Dry Willow to the chaos of federal courtrooms. "I think Buck's earned his retirement," Jake said, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "He's done enough fighting for one lifetime." Agent David Park's car pulled into the driveway, dust trailing behind it in the evening light. Park had become a regular visitor to Dry Willow, partly for official follow-up on the case, and partly because he'd developed a friendship with the Morrison family that transcended professional obligations. "Evening, Olm," Park said, climbing out of his car with a bottle of wine and what looked like official documents. "I bring news from Washington, and I thought we should celebrate." Emma ran over with the puppy bounding beside her. "Agent Park, look how much Sage has grown. She can sit and stay and come when called." Park knelt down to pet the puppy, who immediately began trying to lick his face with enthusiastic affection. "She's beautiful, Emma. Buck's been a good teacher. What's the news from Washington?" Jake asked, though he could guess from Park's expression that it was positive. "The last of Hayes' associates was sentenced today," Park announced, opening the wine bottle with a corkscrew he'd brought. 25 years in federal prison. The network is completely dismantled. The money has been recovered, and the victims' families have been compensated." Sarah raised her coffee mug in a toast. "To Frank Rawlings, who never gave up fighting for justice." To Buck, Jake added, "Who brought us all together and kept us safe." "To family," Emma said solemnly, raising her glass of lemonade. "Because that's what matters most." They sat together as the stars emerged in the clear desert sky, sharing stories and comfortable silences. Buck moved between them, accepting pets and treats, content to be surrounded by the people who had become his pack. Later, after Park and Sarah had gone home, Jake tucked Emma into bed while Buck supervised from his position beside her door. "Papa, do you ever miss being Detective Morrison instead of just regular Papa Morrison?" Emma asked, her voice sleepy but thoughtful. Jake considered the question seriously. For 20 years, he'd hidden from his past, afraid that Detective Morrison's enemies would find Sheriff Morrison's family. Now that the enemies were gone, he found himself free to be whoever he chose to be. "I think I'm both," he said finally. "Detective Morrison taught me about justice and fighting for what's right. But Papa Morrison learned about family and love and protecting the people who matter most. I need both parts to be complete." Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. "Buck's both too, isn't he? He's a special tactical dog, and also just our Buck who likes belly rubs and sharing popcorn." "That's exactly right, sweetheart." "Good," Emma said, closing her eyes. "I like our family just the way it is." Jake turned off the bedroom light and walked back to the front porch, where Buck was waiting for him. Together, they looked out at the desert that had given them sanctuary and the town that had become their home. The past was finally at peace with the present. Detective Jake Morrison had gotten his justice. Sheriff Jake Morrison had protected his community, and Papa Morrison had raised a daughter who understood that love and courage were the most important things in the world. Buck's tail wagged once in the darkness, and Jake knew his partner agreed completely.